They found him in the ice with his eyes still open, frozen mid-breath, sword gripped tight, armor marked with a cross that hadn't been worn in 700 years. But when they brought him back, when his heart somehow started beating again in that sterile lab in Svalbard, the first words out of his mouth weren't a prayer. They were a warning. Dr. Elena Frost had spent 15 years studying permafrost preservation, but nothing prepared her for what the mining team pulled from the glacier that October morning. The body was impossibly intact, not just preserved, but perfect. A Templar knight, full regalia, locked in ice at over 11,000 feet. His face showed no decay. His leather straps were still supple, and according to the carbon dating, he'd been there since 1307, the year the Templars were destroyed. What made Elena's hands shake wasn't the historical impossibility of finding a Templar in Arctic Norway. It was the faint electrical signature her equipment detected in his chest. A rhythm, slow, impossibly slow, but present. His cells weren't dead. They were dormant, locked in some kind of biological stasis that shouldn't exist in nature. Against every protocol, against her better judgment, she made the call. They would attempt revival. The first 72 hours were a medical nightmare. His core temperature climbed 1 degree every 6 hours. They flooded his system with oxygen-rich compounds, stem cell solutions, experimental cryoprotectants. On day 4, his fingers twitched. On day 6, his eyelids fluttered. And on day 7, at 3:47 in the morning, his eyes opened fully and he drew a breath that sounded like wind through a crypt. He didn't scream, didn't panic. He turned his head slowly, took in the white room, the machines, the faces staring at him through the observation glass, and spoke in flawless medieval French. "How many years have I failed?" Elena brought in Dr. Marcus Webb, a linguist specializing in Old French and Latin. For 3 days, the Templar, he said his name was Guillaume de Marseille, refused to eat, refused to explain. He only repeated the same phrase, "I was holding the line." On the 4th day, Marcus tried a different approach. He asked Guillaume not about the past, but about what he was guarding. That's when everything changed. Guillaume's jaw tightened. He looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen things no history book recorded and said, "You think the Crusades were about Jerusalem, about God and glory. That's the story they tell children." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "We were fighting something that had been buried there for 3,000 years. Something that woke up when we broke open the wrong temple." Over the next week, Guillaume told them a story that made Elena question everything she thought she knew. The Templars, he claimed, hadn't been destroyed by King Philip for their wealth. They'd been destroyed because they refused to abandon their true mission. Beneath the Temple Mount, they'd found a chamber, predating Solomon, predating the Israelites, carved by hands unknown. Inside were 9 stone pillars covered in symbols that predated written language. And when they moved the first pillar, something responded. Something vast and patient that had been waiting in the deep places of the world. "It wasn't a demon," Guillaume said, his scarred hands trembling. "It was older than that. It didn't speak, but it showed us. Visions of what it had done before. Civilizations that rose and fell with no trace because it consumed them from within. It fed on belief, on certainty. It turned brother against brother by making each absolutely sure of their righteousness." He looked directly at Elena. "We managed to reseal it, but 9 of us took an oath. We would stay at the boundary points, the thin places where it might push through again. I was sent north to the edge of the world to watch a crack in the ice that led down into stone older than glaciers." Marcus wanted to dismiss it as delusion, the confused memories of a traumatized mind. But Elena noticed something that made her blood run cold. The symbols Guillaume drew from memory, the ones he said covered those 9 pillars, matched markings found at Göbekli Tepe, at Derinkuyu, at sites that predated known civilization by thousands of years. Markings archaeologists had never been able to translate. Then Guillaume said something that changed everything. "I failed because I'm here. If I'm here, it means I left my post. It means I believed I was dying, and the cold would preserve me until another could take my place. But no one came." He stood, his legs still weak but his bearing pure iron. "How long did you say I was in the ice?" 718 years, Elena whispered. Guillaume closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something in his expression had broken. "Then it's already awake, and no one has been watching. What happened next would be classified, buried under layers of national security protocols. But 3 people in that room knew what they'd heard in Guillaume's voice. Not madness, recognition. Because that same week, reports had been flooding in from intelligence agencies worldwide. A spike in sectarian violence, political movements becoming more extreme, more convinced of their absolute rightness, communities fracturing along lines of belief with a speed that defied normal social dynamics. And at the center of several conflict zones, seismic sensors detected something strange, low-frequency vibrations coming from deep underground, in patterns that almost resembled language. Guillaume insisted on being taken to Svalbard's deepest ice core facility. He studied the samples from various depths, running his fingers over ice that held atmospheric records going back millennia. Then he found it, a layer from 1314, 7 years after he'd taken his position. The ice there was darker, threaded with mineral deposits that formed patterns. The same patterns from the temple, the same patterns now appearing in seismic data. It pushed through while I slept, Guillaume said quietly. Not all the way, just enough to plant seeds, and you've been feeding them for 7 centuries without knowing. He turned to Elena and Marcus. Your wars, your certainties, your absolute convictions that you're right and they're wrong, it feeds on that. It grows in the spaces between people who can't hear each other anymore. Elena wanted to call him delusional. She wanted to dismiss it as medieval superstition translated through trauma. But she couldn't ignore the data, couldn't ignore the patterns, or the fact that Guillaume, against all biological possibility, was standing there at all, kept alive by nothing but an oath and the ice, waiting for someone to continue a watch that no one else knew needed keeping. The project was shut down 2 weeks later. Guillaume disappeared from the facility one night, taking nothing but a coat and a map he'd drawn from memory. They found a note in his room written in careful English he'd learned with startling speed. I know where the cracks are now, where it will push through next. Perhaps one man can still hold a line, even if the world has forgotten there's a war. Elena tried to trace him, but Guillaume de Marseille had walked into the Arctic night and vanished as completely as he'd emerged. Sometimes, late at night, she pulls up the seismic data from the sites he marked on his map. The low-frequency patterns are still there, pulsing in the deep stone like a slow heartbeat. And she wonders if somewhere in the frozen dark, a man 7 centuries out of time is still standing watch, holding a line against something that learned patience before humans learned fire. The question that keeps her awake isn't whether Guillaume was telling the truth. It's whether anyone else will be ready to hold that line when he finally falls.